which clearly establishes that I'm a really old guy. So, glad to remember that. Okay, thanks for giving up a couple hours during a busy time of the semester to do this. I hope I can make it worth your while. After the workshop, I will circulate the slides. All the slides I'll be putting up to anybody whose email address, who registered for this or who wrote down their name and put their email address on the sheet outside. So, let's begin by talking a little bit about the kinds of grants that are available, and then I'll point out what I'm going to be emphasizing today. There are a wide variety of grants available. They fund basic research. Some fund applied research. You can get grants for training, for curriculum development. You can even get grants for putting on a conference and just talking to people. This workshop will emphasize grants to support basic research. But we'll be talking about the key elements of a grant proposal, and even if you want to submit a grant proposal for something different than basic research, the fundamental features of a good grant proposal are the same across all these different types of proposals. Okay, there are a variety of sources for grants. You get grants from federal agencies, NSF and NIH. State and local governments provide grants. Some folks get grants from foreign governments, from corporations. Also, private foundations fund research activities and other things. Today, we're going to be emphasizing those grants from federal agencies, in particular NSF. I'm not going to get into a lot of the nitty-gritty of formatting applications and the like. There is available from NSF, if you Google NSF Grant Proposal Guide, there is this guide that goes through all the formal procedures at NSF, easily searchable, and so if you're actually at the point of writing a grant proposal, you ought to get this NSF Grant Proposal Guide. It'll answer all your questions about procedures. Okay, now, if we had an entire day together, we could look at the organizational chart, organizational structure of NSF. Here it is in chart form, but the bottom line is, no, I don't want to do that. Okay, hopefully that won't appear every 5 minutes. All of your interaction with NSF as a principal investigator, what NSF calls the people that actually submit proposals, all your interaction will be with a unit at the bottom of this organizational chart that's called a program. So all the units at NSF that interact directly with PIs, principal investigators, are called programs. Some of them relate to traditional social science disciplines like sociology, economics, political science, and so forth. Others are multidisciplinary, cut across programs like law and social sciences, methodology, measurement, and statistics, for example. Each of these programs accepts applications twice a year, so there's 2 review cycles. The deadlines for submissions for most social science programs are August 15th and January 15th, roughly the beginning of the fall semester and the beginning of the spring semester. These dates are not completely uniform, so you ought to check that date for the kind of program that you'd be interested in applying to if you get to the point of submission. Most of you would presumably be choosing between a program in your traditional discipline or one of these cross-cutting programs. For any of these programs, the website that's available at NSF will list all the recent proposals that have been funded. They'll show you an abstract for the research, and they'll show you the amount of the award that was given. So looking at this list at the various programs is a good way of figuring out the kinds of research that the program tends to support. And if you're not highly familiar with the sort of the mission of the program, this would be a good way of figuring out pretty quickly what kind of stuff they're looking for. All right, so much for an introduction to NSF as an organization. I'd like to spend a little bit of time focusing on a question geared towards junior faculty in the group. And that is, is it wise for someone untenured to spend time writing a grant proposal that on the surface looks like it may be taking time away from writing papers to submit to journals. The case for saying no, it doesn't make sense to do this is that there's a lot of research that most people can conduct with canned data sets that are widely available, don't take any time to collect, and this is the quickest path to something that can be published and get on your record, so that when you go out for tenure, you have lots of publications. So, in some sense, not getting grants may be the most efficient way of producing a stream of published research for tenure. Now, I can't tell you this argument is completely misguided, but I don't think it's on target for most faculty. A few observations about this. I think the dean and the provost want all of us to get grants, but they also recognize that grants in the social sciences are pretty scarce, and so they don't view it as an essential ingredient for getting tenure. So I think the standards that we face are different from those in the physical sciences, where getting a grant is just almost essential for being able to set up a lab that allows you to produce the stream of research that would get you tenure. People can have productive careers in the social sciences without getting grants, because we don't need this big infusion of funds to build up the infrastructure. So we have this escape clause. Why not take advantage of it? And I think the reason is that there are both enormous short-term and long-term benefits of getting grants, especially ones, federal grants from the government. And I want to talk about these benefits, but first I do want to make clear that this advice that it makes sense for junior faculty to pursue grants applies only to folks who are successfully producing a stream of published research. If you're not making normal progress toward tenure and you're struggling to do that, and your department is warning you during annual evaluations that you need to pick up the pace of publications, the advice to go after grants does not apply. At that point, you ought to be focusing on getting articles published in the most efficient way. But if you're making normal progress towards tenure, I think the cost-benefit calculation is quite a bit different. Because if you can get a grant, your record is going before the provost, coming out of a discipline in which grant support is relatively scarce, but yet you have some of that scarce support. And that's a clear signal to the university that you belong here, and that you're an impressive scholar, and you certainly deserve tenure and hopefully a long, successful career at FSU well into the future. Also, thinking beyond the local community, getting a grant is a valuable way of being recognized as a scholar, an important scholar in your field, in your field nationally. So it's a good foundation for promotion to full professor down the line. Of course, all of this assumes that you're going to get a grant. It doesn't foresee the possibility that you submit a proposal and you don't get funded. But I would argue that even if you aren't successful in a grant application as a junior faculty member, there's significant rewards to doing it, and doing that and applying for these grants enhances your record enough to even justify the time involved. But I would give this advice especially to junior faculty. Write a proposal for a project that you could do in at least a scaled-down fashion, even if you don't get the financial support from NSF. This is the kind of project that's likely to have a fairly low price tag for NSF. You might be asking for one graduate student research assistant for say a year, a month or two of summer salary for yourself. If you're a junior faculty member and your salary is low, that's not going to cost NSF a lot of money. So you're likely to be able to put in a proposal for a sort of a manageable normal science research proposal that won't cost NSF a lot of money. And it means that if NSF doesn't come through the funding, come through with the funding, there's a good chance that your department may be able to come up with the funds to provide you with an RA and get the project funded without the support of NSF. The main implication would be probably that you don't have summer money, but this is probably research you're going to do whether you have summer money or not. You can also reduce the opportunity cost of writing a proposal by taking advantage of internal resources at the university. I imagine those of you who are faculty at one point in your careers took advantage of the first-year assistant professor program that's run out of the Council on Research and Creativity. That same unit provides small summer grants of $14,000 or less for people to write grant proposals and submit them to federal agencies. So you definitely should apply for one of these coffers summer grants if you're intending to write a proposal and submitting it to NSF. And then there's one last point I want to stress here. If you can write proposals that are good enough to get accepted in journals in your discipline, I don't see any reason you can't be successful in writing grant proposals that will get funded. If you can write good articles, you can write good grant proposals. The basic skills for the two are very much the same. For both, you have to know how to come up with an interesting research question. You have to know how to come up with a good research design. You have to write well, convey your ideas. Same skills for both. I think there's a tendency for people to think that getting grants is just so much harder than getting articles published, and it really is not the true. I have some data that I'll be presenting later that hopefully will back this up. But don't be intimidated by the idea that grants are just so difficult to get. Okay. All right. I think it's useful to spend a few minutes talking about the process by which proposals are reviewed by NSF. The slide that eventually will get filled up over here will describe a typical okay, that's
It might just take a second to calm down.
okay.
Okay.
Up. All right, don't breathe. Okay, so this is going to eventually show a typical review process. Oh, let's see. It may be mouse related. Well, I'm going to move through this quickly there. The material. Is that the same? Yeah, okay. All right. Okay, let's go back up. Page up. Nope. There we go. Okay, now, let's see. Here's the, okay. So I put this description of the review process together by talking to 6 directors for programs within the Division of Social and Economic Sciences at NSF. The details vary a little bit from program to program, but the same basic procedures apply. So I think this is a fairly an accurate description of virtually any of the programs in the social sciences. So each of the NSF programs has a panel, typically with about 15 to 20 members, that convenes in DC after submission deadlines and reviews all the proposals that were received by a program. I'd estimate from these discussions with folks at NSF that panels receive an average of about 90 proposals in a typical review cycle. Panelists who give advice and play a key role in choosing what proposals get funded generally serve a term of several years, and the terms are staggered to provide a little bit of institutional memory from year to year. So the first step in this process is the selection of reviewers. Generally, the program director will choose 2 folks from the internal panel to write written reviews. This will usually be the 2 panelists with the research interest closest to the topic of the proposal. But there's also a need to balance the workload across panel participants, so it's not unusual for one of the 2 internal reviewers to be a panel member with interests only tangential to the topic of the research. The program directors tell me that each panel member will compose written reviews of anywhere from 15 to 25 proposals. So basically, you're concentrating a whole year or more of reviewing of manuscripts into this compressed period of a couple of weeks. So it's a very, very demanding job being a panelist. The program director will also solicit 5 to 6 external reviews, generally a mix of folks recommended by the principal investigator and folks that the program director has come up with. Like the typical journal review process, authors will not be told the identities of reviewers, but unlike the journal situation, reviewers do know the identities of the people submitting the proposals. And this makes sense since, unlike the case where papers are submitted to a journal, the reviewer doesn't get to see the final product. And so presumably part of the decision about whether the proposal is worth funding has to do with judging whether the principal investigator has the ability to pull off what's being proposed, and presumably you have to know something about the individual involved in order to make that decision. Okay. After getting the reviews back, the program director will assemble all the proposals being considered and all the reviews that have been received, and make all this stuff available to the panel members. It's all done electronically now. There's a system at NSF called Fastlane, and that's the system for communicating with PIs submitting proposals and for communicating with members of the panel. My sense is that there will usually be 4 to 6 reviews received for a proposal. You'll get the 2 internal reviews. They're almost certain to be completed. And then an average of, say, 3 of the outside reviews will come back. So typically 6 outside reviews will be solicited, and on average, half of them will come back. Sometimes more, sometimes less. The author doesn't find out which reviews were done by outside reviewers and which were done by panel members. Okay, so okay, this is acting up a little bit. That's not one of the points was skipped over in here. So all the panelists fly to DC for a multi-day meeting. Typically lasts 2 to 3 days, and each of the proposals is considered. For each proposal, one of the 2 panel members who wrote a review of the proposal will lead the discussion of the proposal. So you can see this is a system in which these internal reviewers have a great deal of influence over the process. They're the ones that set the agenda for the discussion of the proposal. Now, one way or another, there will be an initial decision for each proposal about whether it may be worthy of funding and thus deserves discussion, or it clearly should not be funded and therefore we don't have to spend any time even talking about it. I've been told by a panelist that quite often the lead panelist on a proposal will say that some proposal is clearly not worthy of support, and at that point, unless some other panel member intervenes and objects to that characterization of the proposal, that proposal will just be set aside and not considered for funding. To use a term from NIH, the proposal will be streamlined out of the process without any active consideration. Of the ones that are not streamlined out, proposals are divided first into a set of groups. It's typically 3 groups, something like must fund, maybe fund, and do not fund. And then after the proposals are put into these groups, they're ranked. At least those in the first 2 categories, must fund and maybe fund. And this is where the input of the panel into the decision ends. At this point, the program director takes over and and makes the final decisions. So, formally speaking, the panel is just advisory to the program director. And it's the program director's responsibility and authority to make whatever decisions he or she wants to make. But as I understand it, program directors rarely deviate from the recommendations of the panel. They stick pretty closely to it. There is some pressure, though, to sort of come up with a balanced portfolio of funding. And that's where the program director can come in if the program director realizes that too much of the funding is concentrated in one subfield because of the nature of the proposals that came in. There may be some marginal adjustment to shift some of the money around. There's also pressure to have diversity with respect to the institutions so that not all the money goes to research universities and some will go to liberal arts colleges and the like. But for the most part, the panel recommendation holds.
Bill?
Yes?
Can I ask a question or shall I wait till the end?
Fine. Yeah, anybody can ask a question. You don't need to wait till the end.
I was wondering how they choose the panelists. Do they, could junior faculty become a panelist?
Yeah, and I'll be making a point. I will suggest a process how, if you're not reviewing, you volunteer. There is an actual mechanism at NSF to recruit new reviewers. Just like because of the proliferation of journals and demands for more and more reviews for faculty member, NSF is eager to get people to sign up as reviewers, and so that's one of the ways you can get known to program directors at NSF by actually volunteering to review. Okay. So in any event, that's the review process at NSF. We're going to turn our attention now to the most important topic for someone seeking grant support, and that is the question, how do you write a proposal that's going to receive funding? And the simplest answer is propose to do good research. So we're done. I think I've explained everything. There's a lot of truth to that point. Fortunately, we all know how to do good research, and so we're all, 80 to 90% of the way to where we need to be in order to get grant support. But it's the last 10 or 20%, which can mean the difference between success or not, that today is about. And this involves sort of tricks of the trade specific to writing grant proposals. Things that make good grant proposals subtly different from good manuscripts that are submitted to journals. So hopefully in the next hour and 15 minutes I can help give you that last 10 or 20%. And to begin, let's try to think about the differences between the review process for NSF and that for journal articles, because I think these differences have implications for how a good grant proposal needs to be written. Okay. So one difference between the review process at journals and the review process at NSF is the type of reviewers. When you submit a manuscript to a journal, the reviewers selected are nearly always going to be people from your subfield who are familiar with the literatures involved in the research and the issues you're going to be discussing. With NSF, although the external reviewers will be folks from your subfield, and one or two panel members will probably be from fields similar to your own, the panel making the decision is going to consist of people with widely diverse specialties. So the relevant audience for a NSF proposal is much more diverse than the relevant audience for a manuscript that's being submitted to a journal. And the key implication of this is that you need to write a proposal that can be easily understood by social scientists who know next to nothing about your subfield, let alone the specifics of your research proposal. So you got to write a proposal that speaks broadly to social scientists and not narrowly to people that are highly familiar with your area of research. And so one implication of this is that it's essential to avoid jargon that's going to be clear only to people that are highly familiar with the kind of work you're doing. And so you have to have a little bit different mindset as you're sitting there at the keyboard composing text for your NSF proposal. Whenever you catch yourself writing something that's jargony, you have to try to avoid that language and see if you can come up with a way of describing that in a way that virtually any social scientist can understand. And only if the answer is no, there's just no way to get around using this term, should you use that term. But when that's the case, the first time you use that term, you need to define it very, very clearly. But the problem is, for people for whom that's the first exposure to that term, I guarantee you by the time they're to the next page, they won't remember what that term means. So if you use jargon, you not only have to define a term, but you have to keep reminding people as you work your way through the proposal and the text. Periodically reminding people of the definition of that term. So it's best to avoid jargon entirely, but if you can't, at least define it and remind people frequently. Also, try to be highly consistent in your terminology. Don't vary your language by using synonyms. Sometimes we're taught in writing courses that it's boring to just keep using the same term over and over. Vary your language. Ignore that. Ignore that. You've got one term, consistent term for any concept that appears more than once in your proposal. You have a single term for it. And just drive that in and use it over and over and over. You don't want people confused and trying to remember, is this the same thing as that? No ambiguity. One term for everything. And this means consistency across the text, any tables, any figures. Just be boring in your use of language. Okay, so that's one key difference between the review process at journals and NSF that has implications for the types of proposal you want to submit. A second difference is in the workload of reviewers. A reviewer for a journal is reviewing one manuscript at a time. Now, typically people get more than one invitation in a year to submit, to write reviews for journals, but typically they're spread out over the year. And so you're doing one at a time. In contrast, we've seen that an NSF panel member is writing reviews for anywhere from 15 to 25 proposals at a time, and eventually is expected to be familiar with an additional 60 to 75 proposals. So what are the implications of this? Well, presumably, journal reviewers will read your manuscript from cover to cover. Sometimes it's hard to believe that, given the kind of reviews that you get. It's hard to believe they've actually read your paper, but I think most journal reviewers will read your entire paper. But for an NSF proposal, most panel members will not read your proposal completely. And even those panel members that are writing reviews, you know, may look at a stack of 25 reviews and say, I don't know if I have the time to read everything in this proposal. I'm gonna look for some shortcuts. Panel. I mean, I've talked to panelists who will frankly admit that how much attention a proposal gets depends upon sort of the random order in which they're read. If it's read early in the process, when there's still enthusiasm for reading proposals, it gets a relatively large amount of attention. If it's the 25th proposal is being read, much more quickly passing through that. And you obviously have no control of where you're going to be in that process. So you have to recognize the possibility that you're going to be dealing with reviewers who are not going to read your entire proposal. You know, I've talked to panel members who will tell me that a substantial number of the proposals they look at are in a taxi ride from Reagan Airport to the site where they're going to the panel, or when they're on the plane flying to DC and there's a screaming baby next to them. I mean, so these things are not going to be read in pristine conditions as well. There are going to be a lot of sort of alternative kinds of things competing for the reviewer's attention. So, what are the implications for for submitting proposals? You have to assume that people are not going to read it. The key people that are going to make the decision are not going to read it carefully. More specifically, you need to write a proposal so that if someone reads the abstract and then just bounces around the rest of the proposal, reading a paragraph here and a paragraph there, they will be able to understand and value the proposal. That's the real challenge. Can you convince people that are just kind of looking a little bit here, looking a little bit there, skimming through, reading the abstract, but just beyond that, kind of going through haphazardly, will they be able to figure out what you want to do? Okay, so there are a few tips that I can offer to help come up with a proposal that will accomplish this. The best way, I think the way I'm going to structure this, the way I plan to structure this, is to look at the sections that are part of an NSF proposal, and then make some comments about the various components of the proposal. So, yeah. So let's talk about the structure or organization of an NSF proposal. NSF grant proposals are divided into a number of discrete sections. Start with a cover page, and then what's called a project summary, what we would normally call an abstract for the paper. There's a table of contents, the project description. This is the heart of the proposal. List of references, biographical sketches, a budget, a statement of current and pending support from other federal agencies, and then sort of a boilerplate document that the university provides about facilities, equipment, and other resources. So let me offer comments about at least some of these sections. I'm going to skip over the cover page. It's not too controversial a section, and talk a little bit first about the project summary. I think this is the single most important section of an NSF proposal. What we would normally call the abstract, or what NSF calls the project summary. The quality of an abstract for a grant proposal is a lot more important than the quality of an abstract in a paper being submitted to a journal. This is because I think it's unlikely that a manuscript for a journal is going to give up on a paper entirely if the abstract is not very good, if the abstract doesn't clearly describe the nature of the research. I know I've read manuscripts for journals where the abstract has been terrible. I go ahead and read the paper and realize it's a good paper. It was a haphazardly produced abstract that was produced as an afterthought and didn't do justice to the paper, and so I go and give it a positive review. I think that logic probably holds with the two panel members that have been charged with being a reviewer of the proposal, and with some of the external reviewers, but it certainly doesn't apply to the panel members who have to look at 75 perhaps proposals beyond the ones that they've done their review on. For those folks, if they read the project summary and it isn't obvious to them why that this is a good proposal, many will just give up at that point and not go any further. So an abstract needs to be compelling enough to establish the importance of the research, even to someone looking for an excuse not to read it, so that you can move on to the next proposal. A good abstract needs to clarify the basic nature of the proposed research well enough so that someone could read the abstract and nothing else and know basically what the PI is proposing to do. You really have to think about producing a document that stands alone, and somebody can look at it and read it and know essentially what you're proposing to do. You don't want people scratching their heads after reading and thinking, I'm just not sure what this person is getting at. That's a prescription for disaster when submitting a proposal. So a good abstract will make the case succinctly for why the research is valuable to people who know nothing about your topic. The abstract should clarify sort of the key elements of your theory and your core hypothesis, a little about your research design, but the most important thing is making clear what your question is and why it's going to be important to more than just a narrow group of scholars in your narrow subfield. Okay. Note that NSF allows a full single-spaced page for the abstract. Actually, the limit is the actual limit is no more than 1 page and no more than 4,600 characters, including spaces. But unless you have a weird distribution of characters per word, really the operational limit is 1 page. And that's, yeah.
We have a question about the importance of the research. So how broad, I know it's like there's no clear line, but usually like how broad you should say your research is important? Like what is the broad audience?
Yeah, well, I mean, for those of us, if you're submitting to a disciplinary what are the core disciplines, then that it's fair to limit the scope to that discipline and assume they're not going to be readers outside of that discipline. The challenge is a little greater when you're in these programs that cut across disciplines, where then you have an audience that could be drawn from multiple disciplines, and that may create problems for communication.
So it depends on the discipline.
Yeah. I say you have to speak to any social scientist, but really, it's the people within your discipline, but it's all subfields. I mean, it really is. These panels will be designed to sort of cover the entire discipline, extending across all subfields, and so you have to take a really broad view of the kinds of people that are going to be looking at your proposal.
Because sometimes in the NSF proposal, they will have the broad impact, that section.
That's okay.
So
We'll
that's
talk a
like
little about that.
More about community.
Yeah, you need to talk about, and I'll say a few words about that in a moment. Let me get to that. Yeah. Well, let me actually just talk about this now. But first, let me just point out that full page is a lot of space. I don't know about the journals you submit to. I'm used to like 150 word limit for an abstract when submitting to a journal, and this is much more space. So you have an opportunity to make your points and really clarify the value of your proposed research. So yeah, this is the issue that you're getting at. So an NSF proposal is supposed to discuss both the intellectual merit of the proposal, sort of the value for basic science, and broader impacts. And NSF is explicit that the project summary address both of these dimensions. To be blunt, the decision about what proposals are going to get funded is going to be based almost exclusively on this intellectual merit component. This is in there for Congress. No one's ever told me that explicitly, but my impression is this is in there for Congress. So there, and I will talk a little bit later about some of the kinds of broader impacts that NSF is seriously interested in. But the panel members are leading scholars from your discipline. They presumably spend their time doing basic research, and they're going to want to direct their money to people doing basic research for the most part, especially if you're dealing with NSF. So you gotta give some lip service to basic to broader impacts, but the emphasis should be on making the case about the intellectual merit of the proposal. Now, a widely adopted convention for a project summary is one that has at the end of it a summary of the intellectual merit. So most of the project summary would be your description of the project, your case for why it's important, and at the end you'd have a couple of sections actually labeled intellectual merit and broader impacts, where you'd have a few sentences summarizing what the key merits are in terms of the basic science, and then a statement about the broader impact. Okay. Yeah. I'm sure each of you has your own style for composing abstracts. I know some people sort of write that first, some people write it last. If you're a beginning person, I would encourage you to try doing it at the end. I think people tend to write better abstracts when they've actually written the proposal and see how that reads than at the outset. But either way, the key is not to let the abstract just be an afterthought. People tend to do that. They forget about writing an abstract for a paper they're submitting to a journal, and they wind up writing the abstract right when they're at the website for submitting the paper and scribbling out a few sentences, and that's it. And that won't work if you're trying to put together a compelling project summary. A related point is that you should not write a project summary by simply cutting and pasting sentences from the rest of the proposal. You want reviewers and panelists to think that you wrote it with a lot of care and you gave it a lot of attention. And if you just take exact sentences from the proposal and stick them into the project summary, it's going to be clear that you did not give the project summary much attention and thought. Now, there's going to be consistency in terminology because of advice I gave you earlier to not use lots of synonyms and so forth. So there's going to be a lot of repetition, but it just don't borrow exact sentences from the proposal to put into the project summary. One stylistic oddity to note: NSF insists that the project summary be written in the third person. The rest of the proposal, first person is fine, and that's the norm. But frankly, I think the reason it's in third person is that this is the part of the proposal that's going to be posted on the website describing the research that's funded, and NSF thinks that it makes more sense to have that written as in the third person, describing projects rather than people talking about their research. And then the more important point is the one there at the end. Ask lots of colleagues to read a draft of your abstract. And make sure that you ask both people in your field and people outside of your field. This is an easy request to make. It's not going to take somebody more than 5 minutes to read your abstract. And so you don't need to feel like you're putting them out by asking them to do hours of work. So ask lots of people, ask 5 to 10 people to comment on your abstract. And as a bonus, some of these people will feel guilty that they're not being asked to comment on the whole thing, and they'll volunteer to read the proposal, and you can take advantage of that offer to get comments on the proposal.
Bill, I just want to note that our office, the Office of Proposal Development, will also read your abstract and your entire proposal and provide a review for you as well. And if you need assistance getting external reviewer, we can do that as well. And then for graduate students, there is the Office of Graduate Students or Graduate Awards and Fellowships, and they can review your proposal. So send it to your university support services as well.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's good information to know. Okay, so let's move beyond the project summary. I'm going to skip one of these other sections again, the table of contents, not terribly interesting, and move on to talk a little bit about the project description. This is the guts of the proposal. NSF limits the project description to 15 pages, but it allows for single spacing, so you know, 15 pages is not a tiny amount of space. NSF also says you can use as small as 10-point font. Ignore this advice. Ignore this NSF rule. My advice is you use 12-point font, maybe 11, but better 12. As a self-admitted old guy, I can tell you that when you reach 40, 10-point font starts to look very, very small and is very difficult to read for most people. And so you don't want your reviewers PO'd that they have to squint and in order to read your proposal. So make it 12-point, make it easy for even people like me to read your proposal. But beyond that, let's talk a little bit about the content of the project description. NSF gives has no rules about the organization of this section. The only thing they say about this project description section is that it can't be more than 15 pages. So there's a lot of flexibility in how you'd set this up. Nevertheless, my advice is that an NSF project description should usually start with a section that has the boring title of Introduction. The idea is to give reviewers a section that they can easily identify that summarizes the key features of the proposal. And by labeling this section as Introduction, you're very clearly signaling that that's where reviewers can find this information. So I think reviewers looking for a basic justification of the importance of the proposed research will naturally, if they see a section called Introduction, gravitate toward that section for that information. I think the introduction should include statement of the problem or the research question, the essential aspects of your theory, at least some of your hypotheses that come out of that theory, the significance of your research, operational definitions of key variables involved, and then key features of your methodology. And obviously the type of your research that you're proposing will influence these subjects. I'm thinking of frankly, of a standard research project I would see in my discipline of political science. I think a good way to think about the introduction is to consider it a longer and a bit more detailed version of the project summary. It's not that much different than the project summary, except that it's going to take it's going to take more than a page. So you're going to repeat a lot of what is in that project summary, and you're going to flesh it out just a little bit more. The idea is the project summary catches people's attention, makes them want to read further, and then you get them to read the introduction that reinforces the points you made in the project summary and elaborates on them a little bit more. You've all written introductions to papers. There's nothing especially novel here about a grant proposal, but once again, in this section, you have to keep in mind the diverse interests of the people that are going to be reading it, the panel members that are going to be making a decision, and so you have to continue to avoid jargon and use language that people in your discipline will understand regardless of what their specific interests are. And you know, this is a case. This is the section where you again drive home why your research is going to be interesting to people beyond your narrow subfield, and is going to be research that will speak to a much more diverse audience. For the rest of the project description beyond the introduction, there's obviously no single best format. But in addition to the sort of standard elements of any research design, you know, what the theory is, what the hypotheses are, the basic features of the design, somewhere you should include each of these topics. There should be some discussion of the previous literature, a timeline for research to show panelists that you've kind of thought about the practical implications of the research project, and it's manageable, it's feasible to get done in the time that time period you've proposed for the research. I'll talk a little bit later about sort of making a case for describing how you're going to disseminate results to the profession. There's got to be a section about the qualifications of the principal investigator. Again, people aren't seeing the finished product, they're just seeing a proposal, and you have to convince them that you can kind of pull off what you're proposing to do, and then some discussion of the broader impacts. Yeah.
Is there any restrictions on the timeline for research? Can you propose something for 2 years or 5 years? Or?
I'm pretty sure there are no formal restrictions. That there's no absolute limit on the period of a grant. I may be wrong on that, but whether there is in a formal sense, informally, there is, and I think it's there are some grants. What are those called? Those early career grants that are like for 5 years. But those are unusual, and those are not to support just a specific research project, but the development of a career, and those are restricted to junior people. So you know, a year or two is probably the most that you want to go after, especially as a young faculty member without a strong track record. You can find information from NSF web pages about sort of the median length of a proposal to kind of get a sense of how long for the length of time periods for which any program tends to fund research, and kind of use that as a way of deciding whether you're asking for something that is going to be sort of well received. Okay. So how you fit all this information in a coherent fashion will depend upon your specific project. But whatever you do, my advice is have lots of sections and subsections. More than you would probably use in a manuscript you're submitting to be published in a journal. Yeah, you don't, there's no specific set of subsection headings that you need to conform to, but you should divide the project description into a large number of sections and subsections and maybe even subsections with explicit headings on each. It's not a problem for a section to consist of a single paragraph. Not a problem at all. So why do I make this argument? Well, this goes back to the point that many people on the panel will be reading only small portions of your proposal. And so by structuring the proposal with lots of headings and subheadings, someone kind of skimming through the proposal can immediately see, just by looking at the structure of your headings and your subheadings, that you have a well-organized proposal that covers sort of comprehensively the kinds of things that you ought to be talking about in a research proposal. So even someone not reading it will get a signal that you know how to do research simply from the fact that you have a logically organized discussion of topics that hits all the key points that you need to discuss when describing your research project. The way I think about this is that if your proposal has a well-organized structure for headings and subheadings, you've sort of done the functional equivalent of producing an outline for the proposal that's embedded within your proposal. So you have a document that someone can read in its entirety, if someone is interested in all the detail, and see the full-fledged argument, but also someone skimming can quickly look at the section headings and subsection headings and see that it's well organized. And so one test you ought to impose on your drafts before you send off a proposal is to look through the proposal, ignoring the text within the section headings, and just look at the section headings and subsection headings and read that through and make sure it flows in a logically organized way, and it covers all the aspects of research that someone would expect to be able to describe the proposal. So the bottom line is that I think that a proposal with lots of headings and subheadings is more panelist friendly, especially for skimmers. So the idea is, you know, if someone's skimming your proposal and comes up with a question, you know, how does the PI expect to do this, or why does the PI think this is important, or I wonder how the PI is going to measure this concept? Well, a skimmer could probably find the answer to that question more quickly if there are lots of headings and subheadings that identify where you would expect to find material to answer a specific question. Okay. Let me offer a few observations about some of the elements that are listed here that you need to cover in a good project description, beginning with the section on the background literature review section. Many proposals I've seen have a separate labeled section for the literature review. Sometimes having a separate section makes sense. Other times, if there's not much literature to talk about, it makes more sense to work this into a different section of the proposal. One point I'd make, though, is that if there's something really important that you want all reviewers to see, don't put it in a section called literature review. Literature review is a section that is very likely to be skimmed, even by the folks that are going to be writing reviews. You know, a lot of people view a literature review section as something that needs to be skimmed through to make sure that the PI is familiar with the major works in the field, And so people will skim through this section just looking for names, citations to the right authors that presumably should be talked about when discussing the literature associated with the research. So don't put important things into the literature review. Personally, I'm not a big fan of literature reviews, long literature reviews in a grant proposal, because space is scarce. You've got 15 pages, and every page you devote to literature review is to some extent a distraction from talking about your own research, which is what you really want to be focusing on in a grant proposal. So, you know, there's really a sort of a fine line here. You want to discuss the literature enough to make it clear to reviewers that you're fully familiar with the literature in the area, you're knowledgeable, but you want to do this without distracting attention and taking valuable space from a clear discussion of your own work. So ideally, you should use the literature review as a springboard for how your proposed research will contribute to the discipline. So a good literature review sort of is structured to nicely lead reviewers to the view that there's some key gap in the literature and you're going to fill it. So don't think of the literature review as just a sort of a discrete section that's somehow separate from what you're talking about. You ought to structure the literature review so that it just walks the reader through a discussion, the end point of which is there's this really important problem that hasn't been investigated, and you know how to deal with that gap in the literature. And in all likelihood, your proposal will be on a topic that you've done work on before, and it's especially important to place your proposed research in the context of the work you've already done on the topic. This is part of establishing your qualifications to do the research. If you can show how the work that you're proposing is a natural outgrowth of successful work that has already been published by you, that sort of leads up to that point, that helps to establish that you're the right person, you're the best person out of anybody in the discipline to do this research because of the work that you've done, before. You also should talk about dissemination of results in your proposal. I take, as a reviewer, I take claims made in this section with a grain of salt. Those of you that have reviewed, I imagine you're going to be familiar with a claim that the proposed research is going to produce several papers that will be presented at academic conferences. Then those papers will be revised for submission to journals. Major scholarly journals is the phrase that's normally used, to be followed by a capstone book manuscript that will tie everything together. At a prestigious university press, that's right. That's where that book is going to be published. Everybody says some version of this. It's kind of silly. Everybody knows that everybody says something like that, but you probably should say it so that people know that you know what to do with research when you get done with it. You know how to get it out there. So you know there ought to be a paragraph on this, on how the research is going to be presented to the academic community. What I do find valuable in terms of a discussion of what will come out of proposed research are data sets. And I think this is something that NSF takes very seriously as well. The idea here is that if you can claim that you're doing some research that is significant in its own right, and then from this research will be created a data set that lots of other folks will be able to use when conducting research, that's a really powerful argument for funding your research. It's not going to only support your narrow research, it's going to plant seeds that are going to be used in the future to support other people's research. So talking about the data sets that are going to be created with your research project is a very valuable thing to stress in a proposal. But note that it's not enough to just say, I'm willing to share my data, because in fact, when you get funded by the federal government, you're obligated to share your data. So that you're not making any concession by simply saying, I'm going to share my data. Everybody has to share their data. So what you want to do is go one step further than I will share my data and make the case that the data you will produce is going to be useful to other people in research. That's the key. Make the case that your data are valuable to the research community. So you make this case. You can make this case by, one way to do it is suggesting other kinds of questions beyond the ones that you're investigating in your research that can be answered using the data. Or you can make this case by pointing to the large number of researchers who study questions similar to the ones that you're studying and presumably could be advantaged, could take advantage of your data. It used to be that people, and I did it myself, would solicit letters from colleagues with similar research interests, having them talk about how they're excited about the data that would be created from the proposal, and those letters were testimonials were submitted as addendum to the project. At least in political science, they put an end to that. They must have gotten inundated with all these testimonials about how data is going to be using, and so you can't do that anymore. You can't include testimonials to the value of your data, but that doesn't preclude you from mentioning the kinds of research questions that might be addressed from your data set in the future. So another section of the proposal, the references. So the references in an NSF proposal are a little bit different than the reference list that you would include in a typical manuscript submitted to a journal. At least for the journals I'm used to submitting to, the only pieces that are cited in the reference list are the ones that are actually specifically mentioned in the text of the article with kind of an author date reference. Those kinds of references are certainly included in an NSF proposal, but the list of references should also include work related to your proposal that you don't explicitly cite in the project description. So this is not part of the 15 pages, and there's no page limit on this, and reviewers won't be terribly distressed to see a really long list of references because they know that they don't have to read through the whole thing. So they're not going to go look at it and say, oh, God, a long list of references. So you don't have to skimp on this. Reference everybody. I don't mean to be cynical here, but I suspect that most reviewers, the first thing they're going to look at when they open a proposal, they're going to turn to the references, go to the section where their name would appear if in alphabetical order, and see if their name is there. So that suggests that you need to think about the most likely reviewers of your proposal, the people that are visible in your discipline, that write in this area, and make sure that their name appears in the references somewhere. Yes.
That's so interesting, Bill. I didn't realize you could reference, articles that you didn't talk about at all in your paper.
Yeah.
And is that's across all NSF programs?
Well,
or?
yeah, you should certainly check.
Okay.
That's certainly the case in political science. I don't know if I've heard that explicitly, but for other disciplines, other programs as well. So you should certainly check that out. But it's hard for me to imagine that's a program specific decision about that format. Okay. So, I guess what I'm proposing then is I've suggested sort of keeping the literature review fairly narrow, trying to focus it on just those things that are directly relevant to your research and that help you build the case that the work you're doing is important. Then at the other extreme, the references are the case where you can throw in lots of all the tangential research that is not directly related to your research topic, but more tangentially related to try to represent the broader literature. Okay, a few other tips on writing and submitting a successful proposal. First, I would encourage you to contact the program director for the sponsoring agency you're submitting to before you submit the proposal, especially if you've never met the person before. And really, I think that's a key factor there. If you know the person already, have interacted with that person, it's not terribly important to make this initial contact. And if you know the program director, then contact the program director only if you have some real questions that you want answered. But if you don't know the program director, think of an excuse to contact that person. Think of some questions that you could ask, even if you have to ask questions that you think you already know the answer to. Better not to make a cold call. Better these days with the prevalence of email to send an email message to the program director saying you're planning to submit a proposal in, say, the next August submission cycle, and you have some questions you'd like to ask, and would it be possible to have a phone conversation about this? So. Again, you could get valuable information, but beyond that, it's nice when the program director can associate a proposal with an actual human being, and have some sense of who that person is before receiving the proposal. One great way of accomplishing the same end is for your department to invite an NSF program officer director to visit the department and make a presentation to faculty about NSF procedures and advice on how to get grants. This is part of each program director's job, traveling around the country, making presentations about NSF. And the great thing is NSF foots the bill for this. Your department doesn't need to pay. They pay the transportation expenses. They'll pay for putting the person up in a hotel. It's a total freebie from the department. You have to contribute a little time to spend some time with the person that's there, but this is a way for not only you but everybody else in your department who hasn't met a program director to make this initial contact. And so. You need to arrange these visits at least a month in advance, ideally even a little bit more. So the procedure for you, recommend that your chair contact the NSF program director that you're interested in meeting with, and extend an invitation, and in all likelihood they will accept the invitation. So it's a good way of making an initial contact with the program director, and giving some visibility to your department. So it seems like a sort of a no-lose proposition. Yeah. Because you're allowed to use 15 pages in the project description, most people will think, wow, I better make use of every bit of this space. That's really not a great idea. One panel member that I talked to said that the most impressive proposal that he's read in his several years on a panel was a proposal that made the case for 2 entirely discrete research projects within the 15-page limit. That each one was described succinctly and well in a short amount of space, and that was just tremendously impressive. And I think panelists are very impressed with proposals that get to the point quickly and make their case in a compact fashion. Now, this doesn't mean that you ought to leave out important points to come in under the 15-page limit, but don't just pad the proposal up to 15 pages just to fill it because you have room for it. So what I try to do in writing an NSF proposal is I'll shoot for writing a first draft of the project description that covers all the things that I think are important, need to include in 15 pages. And then I'll undertake several rounds of revision, and typically discover that I can weed out a page or two without sacrificing any fundamental content, and wind up with a tighter document that makes the points more quickly and more efficiently, and therefore is going to be less frustrating to reviewers. Remember, they have to read 15 to 20, 25 of these proposals, skim through others. If you come in 12, 13 pages, they're going to be grateful not to have to read the 14th and 15th page. So just be open to the idea of keeping this a little shorter than 15 pages if you can accomplish that. All right, let me talk a little bit about success rates for NSF proposals. Across the Division of Social and Economic Sciences, the funding rate in 2014 and 2015 was 22 to 23%. That is, a little more than a fifth of proposals submitted were given funding. There's a little variation you can see across different programs, but not a tremendous amount. Okay, now let me make a comment about the population of these proposals. Someone serving on an NSF panel, whose judgment I trust, once told me how shocked they were at the poor quality of a good half of the proposals that were reviewed by the panel. More than half the proposals received lack basic competence. There's just a fundamental error in the research design. The thing was just poorly written, incoherent, poorly organized, just something that jumps out at you that just says, this is just not good. And I've also heard other panel members disparage the quality of the median proposal. So, there are a bunch of proposals out there that are just not very good. So, one way to think about this is, let's assume 22% of proposals that are funded. If the panel member who complained to me about the quality of the median proposal is right, then at least 50% of the proposals are going to be weak and not given serious consideration. And so if you write a fundamentally sound proposal, well written, has a clear research question, clear research design, and so forth, you're not going to be in that half that's going to be dismissed as terrible. And so this 22% acceptance rate is probably double that size for proposals that are serious and well written. And so if you can produce a proposal, hopefully everyone in this room that's competent, your success rate ought to be in that 40% range. I'm not giving any guarantees, but I mean, the basic point is that this doesn't look so terrible when compared to submitting manuscripts to journals. Most of the journals I submit to have lower acceptance rates than this. And so I firmly believe that if you can get your research published in good journals, if you've had success with journals, your work should get into the mix at NSF and give you a serious, realistic chance of getting a grant. So that suggests that submitting grant proposals is worth the effort. I think there's a tendency, especially for junior faculty, to think that only the most brilliant, innovative projects are going to get funding from NSF. But that's not the case. You don't need to introduce a brand new paradigm or approach to the discipline. Good, solid, normal science research can get funding at NSF. Okay, let me make a few more observations. One of the biggest rookie mistakes is expecting these proposals to be produced and well written in a lot shorter time than is typically the case. I recommend assuming it's going to take a good 3 to 4 months to put together a good research proposal. There's naturally a tendency to wait until close to the deadline to start writing, and it just doesn't work well. Start 3 to 4 months in advance. That gives you the time to write a first draft, set it aside for a couple of weeks, come back to it after you've had a chance to sort of forget about exactly what's in it, and you'll be able to read it more objectively for its quality. And then you're gonna want to ask lots of people to read the draft and make comments, and you need to give them a couple of weeks in order to expect some decent comments. And then you want to have time to read the reviews, the internal reviews you'll get from people to read it, and have time to revise. And so you add all these little 2-week periods together, and really it's going to take a good 3 to 4 months to produce a proposal that you can be proud of. Ask lots of people to read the proposal. And I think there's a tendency to tend to give it to close colleagues or people that are familiar with your work and with whom you share interests. And there ought to be people like that, but remember, the panel is going to be diverse. And so you want some of the people commenting on your drafts to be people who know nothing about your research. They're going to be the best sort of simulations of people on the panel who know nothing about your specific research. So give it to colleagues that really share very little interest with what you're doing.
If you ask someone to read your proposal, does that disqualify them from being a reviewer?
Oh yeah, but well, I'm thinking yes. Does that formally disqualify you? Probably not, because I'm thinking of the questions about conflict of interest that are there in the proposal. But I would hesitate to do that, to seek informal advice from somebody, and then recommend that person as a reviewer. So NSF asks you to recommend people for reviews. Now, but you shouldn't think about the fact that someone is likely to be a reviewer and therefore I can't send this person a review. It's only, I think the only potential conflict of interest is giving the paper, giving the proposal to someone to make comment on, and then actively recommending them as a potential reviewer. And I'm not sure whether that's formally disallowed, but I could see it would be awkward if one of the reviewers said, I read this proposal earlier and gave this comment, and the person, blah, 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 and it creates a potential awkwardness and potential possibility that you're not being kind of upfront with the program director about conflicts of interest and the like. If your department has a seminar series or discussion group, volunteer to present your proposal. That's a good way that the members of your department across fields is a good simulation of a diverse panel. 5 more minutes. Let's see. Yeah, let me talk a little about budget. Early in your career, I recommend not shooting for a proposal that's going to require a really large level of funding. NSF is much more likely to take a chance on someone without a long track record if there's only $75,000 at risk than if there's $300,000 to $400,000 at risk. I suggest for your initial proposal, you go to the website, find out the median size of the award that the program gives, and make sure you're under that, and actually even better, substantially under that median. For the specific dollar amount to request, I recommend that you ask for more than you expect to get. This is advice straight out of the literature and budgeting. They're very likely to cut. You want to make sure that after they cut, you have enough left to get done with your work. So you should anticipate the possibility of the cut and make sure that you can absorb a cut of 10 to 15% without having to cut out the meat of the proposed research. On the other hand, you don't want to pad dramatically. People on panels have used the term sticker shock to describe a situation where a proposal comes in asking for a certain amount of money, and it looks to everybody like, that could be done, much less expensively than that. One of the things that I try to do in each proposal is to think of an element of the project that would be a bit of an enhancement, but is not fundamental to the project, and include that in the proposal as well. With the expectation, if the program the director comes back to you and says, we like this, but it's going to cost too much, can you live, can you get the project done with 10% less? You can say, yep, I can do that, and that extra element that wasn't critical to what you needed to do is the one that gets turned off. The last NSF grant I got, I submitted, I included a conference. I made the argument that bunches of people are going to use this data, and so a year after the end of the grant period and the data were disseminated, I'd have a conference at FSU, we'd bring in people using the data, we'd talk about it and so forth. That was my standalone element that wasn't critical. As it turned out, there were no cuts to the budget. I got that money, but that turned out to be my safety valve as well. The other advantage of that extra element is if you realize you under budgeted for the core research, you can raid that money for the extra element and use it for the core research, which is actually what I wound up doing when I realized I didn't have enough money. So I dispensed with the conference and just used that to support the basic research. Yeah, and let me just finish with the point that came up earlier. If you haven't been asked yet to do an NSF review, volunteer. There's no substitute in turn. If you can create an impression, if you can convince the program director that you're a serious person with good ideas and understands how to do research, that gives you a tremendous leg up in the process when you wind up submitting a proposal. And the easiest way to establish your credibility is to do reviews, do them well, do them seriously, do them professionally, and is all you need to do is send an email, get the email address of the program director, send them an email saying that you're interested in doing reviews. You introduce yourself, describe your areas of expertise. NSF specifically recommends that these letters of introduction, when they come, are emailed with a 2-page CV attached. NSF has a format for a 2-page curriculum vitae, so you can look up that, do a 2-page vitae for yourself. You submit that along with your letter, and I'd be shocked if you didn't get a request for review fairly soon after submitting that. Okay, not much time, but you all have any questions? Yeah.
What is a big mistake that you see a lot of people, or even possibly yourself, has done in the past when they write the proposal for grants that you wish they could do different?
Yeah, you know, I think there is a tendency, and I've noticed, and I've heard panel members talk about that, is especially for people that are new to the process of sort of over-promising, you know, of being too grandiose in sort of expectations. If people get the sense that you're kind of BSing about, you know, all the wonderful things that are going to be accomplished with a relatively small amount of money, you know, they're going to be skeptical that you're really serious about the project. So it's a fine line. You want to brag, you want to tell people how great your work is, but on the other hand, you have to be sort of realistic about expectations and kind of rein it in a little bit. Did you?
Yes, I have a very simple question. So
those of you that need to leave for other things, feel free to at any time, but people can stick around.
If I can submit my draft on the deadline around the August 1st or something like that, when can I know the final result is about?
Yeah, I'm trying to think back, and you know, I don't know exactly how quickly every field moves. When In political science, I typically wouldn't hear back about an August 15th submission until close to the end of the calendar year. And I think with January 15th submissions, you often don't hear about it. If you've, typically in a January submission, people will talk about a grant, say, starting in August, or in May, starting in the summer. And it can be pretty tight. Sometimes you don't get word until very much close to the summer that the money's coming through. I think most program directors are pretty good about giving people who are going to get funding a heads up. So even after it's pretty clear and the program director decides who's going to get funded, for the award to actually be made, it has to go through the bureaucracy in NSF, and it finally generates a formal acceptance letter. But typically, program directors will send out a notification saying, I can't absolutely promise, but you can expect to get a grant for this amount. And at that point, you can start planning. You wouldn't want to make any commitments that couldn't be retracted, but most units around the campus will begin the process under the assumption that notification is sufficient to indicate that a grant will actually be forthcoming. Other questions? All right. Well, thanks again for spending some time this afternoon.